There is a gorge in western New York where the Genesee River cuts down through the rock in a chain of great waterfalls. And for a few miles, the land simply falls away, a green chasm hundreds of feet deep, with the river a thin ribbon at the bottom. And for 23 years, from the summer of 1852 into the spring of 1875, there stood across that chasm one of the most astonishing structures ever raised in this country, a railroad bridge. It was high enough that you could have stood the tallest building of its day beneath it and still had room to spare. It ran the length of 2.5 football fields, and it was made, every single stick of it, out of wood. When it opened, it was the largest wooden bridge in the world, and iron locomotives crossed it, 20 of them a day in each direction, rolling over a lattice of timber more than 200 feet in the air. They built it in about 14 months, by hand, with almost no machinery, out of 1.5 million board feet of pine, cut from more than 200 acres of forest. And the men who did it, mostly Irish laborers working 200 feet above a river, made it a point of pride that not one of them died in the building of it. And here is the part that stops me. After the years of work, and the 14 months of danger, and the 2 decades of trains, the whole thing burned to the ground in a single night, in less than an hour, while one man stood and watched it go. His name was Pardon Earle. He was the watchman on duty, and there was nothing on earth he could do but watch the largest wooden bridge in the world turn into a wall of fire. I want to tell you the whole story, because it is one of the great forgotten feats of American engineering. The engineer who took charge of the final design was named Silas Seymour. The laborers were largely Irish, and their individual names, most of them, the records did not keep, which is a shame, because they did something almost no one alive today would attempt. So I will tell you what they did, and let the work speak, because for 23 years it hung over that gorge and stopped everyone who saw it in their tracks. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button, come back. Start with the gorge itself, because the gorge is the whole reason the bridge had to be so extraordinary. The Genesee at this spot has spent tens of thousands of years sawing down through solid rock, and it has left behind a canyon of sheer cliffs and thundering waterfalls that people in the 1800s called, without embarrassment, sublime. The upper falls drop in a white curtain, and just above them the walls of the gorge stand more than 200 feet apart and just as deep. It is a beautiful place and a brutal one, and in the middle of the 19th century it sat squarely in the path of the future. Because the railroads were coming, and nothing was going to stop them, in those years the young country was stitching itself together with iron rails at a furious pace, and the Erie Railroad was pushing a great line across the southern tier of New York, reaching for the Great Lakes, part of the first wave of railroads that would knit the eastern seaboard to the interior. This was the work of the age, the thing everyone was talking about, and the Erie's line was one of the longest and most ambitious in the world when it was finished. But an ambitious railroad still has to obey the hard facts of physics, and right across its path lay the Genesee Gorge. And here is the problem: a gorge like that hands an engineer. A railroad hates 2 things above all others: a steep grade and a sharp curve, because a heavy train cannot climb a real hill and cannot whip around a tight corner. So you cannot simply run the tracks down one wall of the chasm, across the river, and up the other side. The grade would be impossible. The train would never make it. You have to keep the rails nearly level, which means you have to carry the train straight out across the top of the gorge on a bridge, more than 200 feet above the water, as if the chasm were not even there. There was no way around it. If the Erie wanted its railroad, it had to lay a level road across a 200-foot deep canyon, and it had to do it in a hurry. And in the year 1851, the fastest and cheapest way to build almost anything enormous was wood. Iron was expensive, and still scarce for a structure on this scale. But timber, in New York in the 1850s, was everywhere, standing in the forests all around, and there were thousands of men who knew how to work it. So the decision was made to build the Great Bridge of the Genesee out of wood, and to build it fast. Silas Seymour took charge of the final design, and in July of 1851, down in that gorge, the work began. The first thing they had to do was build the foundations, and that meant going down into the chasm. Before a single timber went up, the crews sank 13 great stone piers, massive pillars of cut and mortared stone. built up from the floor and the walls of the gorge to carry the wooden towers that would rise above them. It took something on the order of 10,000 yards of masonry, every stone of it quarried, hauled, and set by hand down in that canyon, along a river that could rise and flood without much warning. The piers were the feet of the bridge, and they had to be perfect, because everything above them, the whole timber city and every train that would ever cross it, would come to rest on those 13 stone legs. It is worth remembering that even the stonework, before any of the famous woodwork began, was a major feat of engineering in a very dangerous place. Consider what that stonework alone demanded. To build a stone pier up from the floor of a gorge, you first have to get men and tools and cut stone down there, along a river with no road beside it. And then you have to raise a solid masonry pillar, course by course, plumb and true, tall enough in places to rival the cliffs around it. The masons worked off timber scaffolding lashed together in the chasm, hoisting each block into place by hand and by rope, mixing mortar on ledges above running water, in a spot where a spring flood could come down the Genesee and sweep away a whole season's work in an afternoon. And they had to make the tops of all 13 piers agree to bring every one of them up to exactly the right height and line so that the wooden bridge above could sit dead level across them. It was patient, precise, punishing work done in the least forgiving place imaginable, and it was finished before the first celebrated timber was ever raised. Then came the wood, and this is where the scale of it becomes hard to hold in your head. They cut 1.5 million board feet of pine, stripping something like 205 acres of forest to feed the bridge, and they did not just stack it. They raised it, timber by timber, into a lattice of towers standing on those stone piers, a framework of interlocking beams braced and pinned together, climbing more than 200 feet into the open air. Men worked up on that growing skeleton with nothing but hand tools, hauling beams up with rope and muscle, fitting and pinning them, standing on the timbers they had set the day before, with the river a sickening distance below. There were no safety lines worth the name. There were no cranes. There was a rising forest of cut wood, and men climbing it, and the open sky of the gorge all around them. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. The way those timbers were locked together was itself a piece of clever engineering. The spans used a design known as the Howe Truss, named for a New Englander named William Howe, and it was a genuine advance. Instead of relying entirely on carpenters to notch and peg every wooden joint by hand, the Howe Truss combined heavy timber for the parts that were being squeezed with iron rods, for the parts that were being stretched, tied together at simple junction boxes. It let a bridge like this be built faster and truer, and it let it be tightened and adjusted as the wood settled and seasoned. So the portage bridge was not a crude pile of lumber. It was a carefully reasoned structure, timber and iron working together, each material doing the job it was best at, engineered by men who understood the forces running through every beam. And they did it, nearly all of them, without falling. The dangerous work of raising that bridge, up in the wind above the Genesee, went on for roughly 2 years, carried out largely by Irish workmen, and when it was finished, the thing they said about it, the thing they were proudest of, was that no one had died building it. Sit with that for a moment. To raise the tallest wooden bridge in the world, 234 feet over a river, by hand, in the early 1850s, and to bring every single man back down the ground alive. That was not luck. That was skill and care and men watching out for one another on the high timbers day after day until the impossible thing was standing. In an age when great works were routinely paid for in workers' lives, the portage bridge was paid for in sweat alone, and the men who built it knew exactly how rare that was. And it is worth pausing on who those men were. In the 1850s, the hardest and most dangerous construction labor in America was done overwhelmingly by Irish immigrants. People who had fled the famine and the poverty of their own country and arrived with almost nothing to sell but their strength and their willingness to do the work no one else wanted. They had dug the canals a generation before, and now they were building the railroads, living in rough camps along the line, moving from job to job, paid little, and remembered less. The men who raised the Portage Bridge were part of that great uncounted army. They did some of the most skilled and most perilous work of the century, 200 feet in the air, and then they packed up and moved on to the next job. And the histories, for the most part, did not trouble to write down their names. When I say this bridge was built by hand, these are the hands I mean. Irishmen far from home, balancing on green timber over a gorge, building a wonder of the age for a daily wage, and bringing every last one of themselves back down alive. When it opened in the late summer of 1852, it was simply the largest and tallest wooden bridge on the face of the earth. Around 800 feet long, some accounts say a full 1,234 feet high, a dark lattice of timber flung across a green chasm, with trains crossing the very top of it. Nothing else like it existed anywhere. And people came just to see it. The gorge was already famous for its beauty, and now it had this man-made wonder laid across it. And the railroad, no fool about a good thing, ran special excursion trains out to Portage so that tourists could ride to the bridge and marvel at it. An advertisement from the 1850s promised scenery of wild and picturesque beauty and sublimity, and the bridge was the centerpiece of the show. People stood on the floor of the gorge and looked up at it. They stood on the rim and looked across it. They rode the cars over the top of it holding their breath, with 200 feet of open air beneath the floorboards. And to actually ride across it must have been something close to terror and wonder at once. Picture the train slowing as it came to the gorge, the passengers crowding to the windows, and then the ground simply vanishing beneath the cars as the locomotive rolled out onto the timber deck. On either side, past the edge of the bridge, there was nothing but air and the tops of the trees far below, the white thread of the upper falls, and the river reduced to a toy at the bottom of the world. The whole structure would give and work a little under the weight of the train, the way a wooden thing does, creaking, alive. For a long minute you were suspended in the open sky on a web of pine, carried across by a machine, higher than you had ever been in your life. People wrote about that feeling for the rest of their days. Some of them never wanted to do it again. Some of them came back every summer just to feel it once more. A whole little world grew up around the spectacle. There was a hotel near the bridge for the visitors who came to see it, and the excursion trade became a genuine business. Families riding out for the day to picnic in the gorge and stand in the shadow of the great bridge. Artists came to paint it. Writers came to describe it. In an age before photographs hung in every parlor, a real wonder like this drew people the way a cathedral or a great waterfall drew them, and the Portage Bridge was spoken of in the same breath as the natural marvels around it, a thing that men had made, and that somehow belonged in the company of waterfalls. And one of those tourists changed the whole future of that valley. In the late 1850s, a Buffalo businessman named William Pryor Letchworth stepped off a train and walked out onto the Portage Bridge to look at the gorge, the way everyone did. And he never really left. The valley that opened up in front of him, the falls and the cliffs and the great wooden bridge, took hold of him so completely that he bought the grounds, built a home on the rim called Glen Iris, and spent the rest of his life and a fortune caring for that stretch of the Genesee. He fell in love with the place from the deck of the wooden bridge. Hold on to that name, William Pryor Letchworth, because he comes back at the end of this story, and what he did is the only reason most people ever get to stand where he stood. Before I tell you what happened next, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories unless enough people click. One click. Come back. Because a wooden bridge is not a monument. It is a machine that has to be maintained, constantly, or it will fail. And the Portage Bridge had one especially clever feature built in for exactly that reason. Wood rots. Wood weathers. Any single beam in that vast lattice would, in time, need to be replaced. And the builders had planned for it. The bridge was designed so that individual timbers could be pulled and swapped, one at a time, without ever stopping the trains. A crew could go out onto the structure, take out a rotting beam, and slide a fresh one into its place, while the great framework held and the schedule ran on. It was almost a living thing, constantly repairing itself under the hands of its keepers, shedding old wood and taking on new, so that the bridge, which burned in 1875, was timber by timber, no longer entirely the same bridge that had opened in 1852. It had been maintained, board by board, for a generation. But all that careful maintenance pointed at the one enemy a wooden railroad bridge could never fully escape, which was fire. Because the trains that crossed it were steam locomotives, and steam locomotives of that era burned coal and threw sparks, live cinders, out of their stacks and their ash pans all day, every day, and underneath the wheels was a bridge made of dry, seasoned, resin-soaked pine. It is hard to imagine a more dangerous pairing, a machine that flings fire rolling across a structure built of kindling 20 times a day in each direction. For 23 years, the railroad understood the danger perfectly well. That is why there were watchmen, men who patrolled the bridge and the ground around it around the clock, walking the great timber lattice, looking for the small blaze, the smoldering tie, the cinder that had caught. Everyone knew that with a wooden bridge, fire was not really a question of if, it was a question of when. The when came in the early hours of the 6th of May, in the year 1875. It was the dead of night. A watchman named William Davis had walked the bridge after a westbound train crossed late in the evening, found everything sound, and near midnight handed off his post to the next man on the shift, Pardon Earl. Earl took up the watch. A little before 1 in the morning, an eastbound train rumbled across the span and passed on into the dark, and Earl walked out across the bridge, checking the way he had done on 100 nights before. And somewhere near the west end, he saw it. A small blaze, a cinder from that last train, most likely, lodged in the dry timber and caught, glowing, then flickering, then beginning to climb, and there was nothing he could do. That is the terrible heart of it. There was, in fact, a water system on the bridge, meant for exactly this emergency. But when the alarm came, the valve that would have opened the lines had rusted, and the wheel would not turn. So the one defense the bridge had against fire failed at the moment it was needed, and Pardon Earl was left alone, in the middle of the night, on a wooden bridge 200 feet in the air, with a fire growing in seasoned pine that had been drying in the sun for 23 years. The flames found the resin in that old wood, and they ran up the timbers and along the lattice faster than any man could move. The largest wooden bridge in the world became, in a matter of minutes, a tower of flame that lit up the whole gorge and could be seen for miles across the sleeping countryside. Pardon Earl could only get himself clear and watch. The entire structure, 1.5 million board feet of pine, 2 years of Irish labor, 23 years of trains and tourists, and careful board-by-board repair, burned through and collapsed into the gorge in less than an hour. And from his home on the rim of that gorge, William Pryor Letchworth almost certainly stood at his window and watched it happen. The bridge that had first drawn him to the valley, the deck he had been standing on when he fell in love with the place, was burning to the ground in the dark below Glen Iris. It is one of the quiet human details of this story that the man who would one day give this whole gorge to the public as a park had to watch its most famous structure die first. And yet, even in the disaster, there is something to hold on to because no one was killed. The bridge burned in the empty middle of the night, between trains, with only the watchman anywhere near it. A wooden giant that had carried 20 trains a day for a generation went down. If a bridge can be said to choose anything, in the 1 hour when it could take no one with it. The men who built it had brought every worker home alive, and the bridge, in its death, killed no one either. All that was lost was the thing itself, and the vital rail line it carried, and the Erie Railroad could not afford to lose that line for long. By dawn, the whole valley knew. The people of the little settlement of Portageville had come out into the night to watch the fire, as helpless as everyone else, and in the morning they came down to the rim to look at what was left. The 13 bare stone piers stood in the drifting smoke like the stumps of some enormous tree. The charred timbers lay tumbled in the gorge below, and the railroad tracks ended abruptly at the edge of the chasm on either side, running out of the trees and stopping at nothing. A structure that had defined their horizon for 23 years, that had brought the trains and the tourists and much of the life of the place, was simply gone between one night and the next morning. For a community built around a railroad, a burned bridge was not only a spectacle. It was the main line severed, the trains halted, the whole town suddenly sitting at the end of a broken road. Everything now depended on how fast the thing could be rebuilt. One quick note. I turned the full story into a book, Everything the Records Gave Me. If you want it, the link is in the description. So they did something almost as astonishing as the original build. They replaced the bridge in iron in 84 days. The fire was on the 6th of May. Within 4 days, before the ashes were even cold, the Erie had let a contract to an ironworks in New Jersey. The design was drawn up by a young engineer named George Morrison, a man who would go on to become one of the greatest bridge builders of the entire age, and for whom the portage job was an early proving ground. His crews reused the old stone piers, the same 13 stone legs that had carried the wooden towers, widening and strengthening them to take the new load. They raised well over 1 million pounds of iron into the gorge, and by the end of July, less than 3 months after the bridge burned, trains were crossing the Genesee again, this time on a bridge of wrought iron, taller and longer than the wooden one, and immune to the spark that had doomed its predecessor. It was a stunning feat of speed and will in its own right. Think for a moment about the pressure on that iron crew. They were working against the clock and against the plain fact that the Erie was bleeding money every day the line stayed cut. They were building on the burned bones of the old bridge, on stone piers that had just come through a fire, in the same dangerous gorge, through the summer heat, and they finished in less time than it takes to build many an ordinary house today. When the first train rolled across the new iron bridge at the end of July, only 84 days after the wooden one had fallen into the gorge in flames, it was a triumph of nerve and organization that ought to be as celebrated as the original build, but it was also the end of an age. The wooden giant was gone, and it was never coming back, because the future, everyone could suddenly see, was iron, and after iron, steel. And portage was only the most spectacular example of something that was happening all across the country. The 1850s and 60s had been the great age of the wooden railroad bridge, thousands of them thrown up quickly and cheaply over every creek and river and gorge in the growing nation. And through the 1870s, one by one, they burned or they rotted, or they simply proved too light for the ever heavier trains, and they came down and went back up in iron. The fire in the Genesee Gorge was one moment in a great turning, the moment the country stopped building its biggest bridges out of the forest and started building them out of the foundry. Something real was gained in that, strength and permanence and safety from the spark. And something was quietly lost too, a whole tradition of working timber up into the sky, the particular skill of the men who could raise a wooden mountain by hand, a way of building that would never really be needed again. I think about what a modern engineer sees when he looks at the old photographs of the wooden portage bridge, because his reaction is a strange mixture of admiration and disbelief. He sees a structure that solved a genuinely hard problem, carrying a level railroad across a 200-foot chasm using the cheapest and most available material of its day. He sees an intelligent truss design, timber and iron working together, and a modular scheme that let a living bridge be repaired without ever stopping a train. He sees foundations of stone and a superstructure of wood, raised entirely by human hands and simple tools, 200 feet in the air, without the loss of a single life. And then he sees the fatal flaw baked into all of it, the plain fact that it was made of wood, in the age of the spark-throwing locomotive, and that no amount of skill or watchfulness could finally change what that meant. The bridge was a masterpiece, and a fire waiting to happen, both at once. And the men who built it knew it and built it anyway, because it was what the moment demanded, and wood was what they had. There is a last chapter, and it is a kinder one. The iron bridge that rose in 84 days served the railroad for 140 years, and when at last it grew too old and too light for modern trains, it was replaced, in our own time, by a great steel arch that opened across the gorge in the winter of 2017. And think for a moment about those 13 stone piers, first laid by hand down in that gorge in 1851. They carried the great wooden bridge for 23 years, and then, widened and strengthened, they carried the iron bridge for 140 more. One set of hand-built stone legs, quarried and mortared by men who have been dust for a century and a half, held up two entirely different bridges across almost the whole span of the railroad age. There is no better proof of how well those first men did their work than the plain fact that the very bottom of their bridge outlasted nearly everything ever built on top of it. And the gorge itself, the falls and the cliffs that the wooden bridge once framed, is now Letchworth State Park, one of the most beloved parks in the state, visited by hundreds of thousands of people a year, because William Pryor Letchworth, the tourist who fell in love with the valley from the deck of that wooden bridge, deeded his 1,000 acres to the people of New York in his old age, so that it could never be spoiled. The man the bridge drew to the gorge ended up saving the gorge for everyone. That is not a bad monument for a bridge that itself did not survive. That is the thing I want to leave you with. We remember the iron bridges and the steel bridges, the ones that lasted, and we have almost entirely forgotten the wooden giant that came before them, the largest wooden bridge in the world, flung across a New York gorge by Irish hands in 14 months without a single death. It stood for 23 years. It carried a nation's freight and a generation of wide-eyed tourists 200 feet above the Genesee. It drew a man to that valley who would one day save it. And then a single cinder and a rusted valve ended it in less than an hour, and we let the whole thing slip out of memory, as if it had never been. But it was there. Pardon Earl saw it burn. Silas Seymour drew it. George Morrison replaced it. Scores of Irish workmen raised it into the sky and walked away alive. And for 23 years, the sight of it hanging over that gorge stopped people in their tracks, the way it stops me now, reading about it more than a century and a half later. We should not need a bridge to burn to notice what it was, and we should not need 150 years to give the men who built it their due. They took the cheapest material in the world and the plainest tools, and out of pine and stone and their own nerve, they raised something that belonged in the company of waterfalls, and they did it without burying a single one of their own. That is not a footnote to the Age of Iron. That is one of the quiet wonders of it. That is worth remembering. That is worth saying out loud. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from Boss Tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.